All right. I think we should get going now. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Naomi Grunditz. I am a aide for Councilman Sandoval in District 1. And we host this series every last Friday of the month called Ask a Planner. And it's an opportunity for casual conversations and Q&A with various planners. Sometimes it's me. I have my background in planning, and that's what I do a lot for the councilman in District 1. But we also mostly bring in guests, planners from community planning and development or transportation planners to talk about different projects that are going on in and around District 1. So thanks so much for joining us. This is being recorded and it's being streamed live on Facebook. And we will post these recordings later on our YouTube page. So anyone who can't make it today can watch those. And during this presentation, feel free to use the chat box to put in questions, or if you're on Facebook, put questions or comments into the chat there. At the end of the presentation, we really just open it up to Q&A, and I will help moderate and bring in any questions that I see in the chat. Or if we have kind of a smaller group, we'll just ask you to unmute and you're welcome to ask questions that way. It really is meant to be, you know, hopefully one day a face-to-face conversation and very casual. But today we are very lucky to have Eugene Howard from City Community Planning and Development, and he is the lead on the West Area Plan, which is part of the Neighborhood Planning Initiative. And I'm going to be turning this over to Eugene. He has a short presentation, and then, as I said, we'll just open it up for discussion, Q&A, comments after that. So I think, Eugene, you should be able to start a presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Naomi, for inviting us to come in and talk to District 1 and to all the other residents who might be listening in. Thank you very much to Councilman Sandoval for this opportunity, and really I'm excited to engage with you all and share a little bit about where we are with the West Area Plan. I'm going to share a presentation, and hopefully that will show up nicely for everyone. So again, this is the Ask the Planner for February. Can you see it all right?
Looks good.
Excellent. I'll just spend a few minutes on this because really we want to spend most of the time engaging in conversation and answering your questions. So I can get the slide. There we go. So really want to give you all an overview of where we are with this West Area Plan, the planning process, some of the things that we've covered, and what we still have left to do, because there's plenty of opportunity for all of you to provide us with really helpful input and feedback. We've spent the better part of the last year, plus a couple of months, doing our homework, going out, really trying to learn and understand the needs of the residents in the 6 neighborhoods, so that we can get to the point where we are right now, which is developing recommendations to address the issues and opportunities that you all have raised for us. So we're actively involved in creating recommendations that speak to those topics, which I'll show you here in just a second. And really want to make sure that you all know where we are and how you can get involved. So for anyone that may be unfamiliar, this is the map of the city and county of Denver. And this map shows you how we have grouped the individual neighborhoods together into our neighborhood planning areas, which is how we refer to NPI, or the Neighborhood Planning Initiative. So there are 19 planning areas where all 78 statistical neighborhoods of Denver have been consolidated into these 19 groups. And we are currently actively working in the West area, which you see highlighted there in the center of your screen. The neighborhoods cover West Colfax, Villa Park, Sun Valley, Val Verde, Barnum West, and Barnum. So really from Sheridan at the boundary of our city and county to the river. And then on the northern edge, it's really Sloan's Lake on down to Alameda Avenue. For today, I wanted to share with you what portion of District 1 is covered by the West Area Planning plan area. So we really cover the western half of the West Colfax neighborhood. And so you can see there how much of District 1 is involved or included in this plan area. So this is the timeline. We really kicked this process off in October of 2019. We spent the months leading up to October getting out in the community, walking the streets, riding our bikes around, driving around, really trying to get familiar with the 6 neighborhoods. We talked with individuals who we encountered along those visits. We met with a number of neighborhood organizations and community-based organizations to really let them know that this planning effort was coming up and let them know how they could get involved and really what we hope to cover through the planning process. And then we had a kickoff in October where we really had a broad swath of the residents in the 6 neighborhoods come and really learn more about the neighborhood planning initiative and what we would like to work with the community in doing and the kind of information that we'd like to have included in the West Area Plan. And then, of course, as we all know, COVID really hit us about a year ago. From October to January, we were able to have one more large public meeting in January at Lake Middle School. And that, along with that meeting, was a resource fair for anyone who might remember or have visited with us. But then COVID hit, and we really quickly had to sort of pivot to an online platform that I'm sure all of us have gotten quite familiar with over the last 12 months. So we kicked everything off in the fall of 2019. We really spent the winter months trying to collect information and input, working with all of the neighborhood organizations and the neighborhood community groups that are serving residents in West Denver to really make sure that we are capturing information and ideas like where are people trying to go to and from, what are the conditions of sidewalks, what are some places that might be opportunities from a land use perspective, thinking about what are your needs related to housing. We know that there's significant pressure in our 6 neighborhoods for affordable housing. How do we, through the city's process, really understand what your needs are with regard to affordable housing and the diversity of housing, the different types of homes, the smaller starter homes, so that family members can return to District 1 and find a place that they can afford and be a part of community. Or if you are a longtime resident and maybe you're an empty nester, all of your kids have grown up and moved out of the house, and you don't necessarily need that large family home, but would like to stay in your neighborhood or in your community. Are there opportunities for us to explore creating more choices as it relates to housing, as an example, so that you can, in fact, find a product in your community at a price point that you feel comfortable with. We talk about parks and open spaces. We've got a robust trail network that runs through these communities. And so we really spend a lot of time listening and capturing that information through the winter and spring. And then last summer, we shared back what we thought we heard and learned. And we wanted to make sure that before we got into working with the steering committee members to create recommendations, we wanted to make sure that we really truly heard you. So we spent a large part of our summer working with community to reflect back the things that we heard, to make sure that we heard it correctly, make sure that there weren't other things that we had maybe missed or things that additional bits of information that people wanted to share. And so we spent the bulk of last summer collecting and verifying the information that we had. And so that brings us to where we are right now, sort of this red central area where we are developing recommendations based off of the information that we heard and the various topics that our plan looks to cover on your behalf. So broadly speaking, we look at land use. So how is the land in your neighborhoods being used? The types of buildings that get constructed, the type of activities that happen in those buildings. And again, parks and open spaces and things like that, which we sort of put under the category of green infrastructure and quality of life. That's a broad topic that covers things like stormwater management, our park and rec facilities, the gulches, and the trails. Trees. We know that in some parts of the 6 neighborhoods, we've got great tree coverage, but in other parts, we could really use more trees to help provide shade and comfort to the residents in those areas. We've heard a lot about access to the trails and to the river for the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the river, and for folks who like to go and see and recreate in and around the river. We've heard a lot about transit and all sorts of modes of travel. So whether you drive, you use an assisted device like a wheelchair, or you ride your bike, or you simply just want to walk and walk safely in your community. We've heard a lot of information and feedback that is leading us in the direction of strong recommendations to improve the health and safety and comfort of the pedestrian and sort of multimodal conditions in the 6 neighborhoods. You know, how do we make recommendations that will allow for investments to make intersections more safe and more comfortable to cross, particularly when we think about our other sister agencies and the work that they're doing. For example, Vision Zero coming out of the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and the real strong need to really look and take a critical hard look at the major corridors of Federal Boulevard, West Colfax, Alameda Avenue, and Sheridan Boulevard, among others. But those are those really large facilities that we know we need to do more to make them safer for the residents in the area. So that's a sample of the types of things that we're covering. We're making recommendations right now. We're developing those. We do have an 18-person steering committee, 3 individuals who are representing the neighborhoods that they are from, and giving us that total of 18. And they've been guiding this process and giving us input and feedback and taking information back to their communities really since September of 2019, prior to our official launch. And so we are working monthly with them. We're always constantly in dialogue, sharing information and ideas, getting their take and their feedback, and calibrating those ideas so that we continue to prepare material that we want to then get in front of you coming this spring. So that's the next step, and that's where we're headed. We want to make sure that we've done as much in capturing the spirit of the desires and wishes, and that those are reflected in the recommendations and the steps and the tasks that we think will be needed in order to make those recommendations a reality. And we're going to bring that information out and share it broadly with all of you, and would love nothing more than to get your feedback on that. And then we will continue to refine and have probably a couple of iterations of hearing from you, making changes, and sharing that back as we move towards developing the full actual plan, which we hope to target getting that completed and ready for public review by summer of 2021. This is just another sort of layout or view of how we think that this will sort of unfold. As with any timeline and any schedule, it's constantly under change and revision. So I'll be working this afternoon to take another look at the schedule. But just to give you an overview, this is generally speaking where we are and what we think is in front of us still left to do. So the thing I want to point out here is that central green bar, community outreach and engagement. We would love nothing more than to get your input and make sure that we are connecting with you as individuals and the organizations that you are a part of, because the community engagement and outreach component is so critical from here moving forward to make sure that we are in fact really honing in and calibrating the recommendations in the plan to speak to your needs and your wishes. And then as I pointed out a moment ago, those sort of iterative steps where we take in information, refine it, share it back out to you. And so we want to spend the first part of this year in that process with the goal of preparing a final document to go through the city adoption process, about August, so late summer. Some of the ways and sort of key components to how we approach the neighborhood planning initiative, and really what we intend to do through this process is building on our citywide foundation that has been established in Blueprint Denver, as well as our comprehensive plan 2040. And one of the key components of those plans is really looking to provide and create more access to opportunity, looking at creating complete communities, and really trying to move us all towards a more equitable city. So thinking about the building of complete communities, all of our communities are rich and robust with all sorts of wonderful assets that we do not want to disturb or modify in any way. However, there are opportunities through the planning efforts and the efforts of the city to make sure that we are making investments where they are really truly needed. So starting from the bottom, moving up, overall quality of life, the complete sidewalks, the safety and security of moving about in your community, making sure that there are ample trees to help provide that shade and that comfort and help also clean the air. Thinking about our stormwater management so that we are cleaning the water that comes from the sky and from our snow before it reaches our gulches and our river, and really let those elements be assets to communities. I spoke a moment ago about mobility and our desire to see all people of all ages and abilities move freely around and throughout our city and feel safe doing so. So it's partially our responsibility to make sure that we are making investments that enable that freedom of movement, no matter how you choose to move, that is available to you. And all of this sort of comes up and sort of gets completed when we think about our built environment. So as I started out talking with a housing example, if you are looking to downsize, or if you want to move back into your neighborhood after going away or college, we want to make sure that there is ample housing supply and different choices so that you can find the type of home that is right for you at the stage of life that you're in. We want to look at ways to help retain the naturally occurring affordability in communities so that individuals can stay in place. We also want to make sure that as we think about the residential side, that we're also thinking about the business side. So we have our beautiful streetcar corridors that have the bones and the infrastructure to help support small businesses and the existing locally owned and family owned businesses. So how do we just think about creating these vibrant, lovely places, building on them? Because they already are there, they already exist, you all live in them. But how do we continue to support them through the planning efforts that we are charged with at the city? The other sort of foundational element, I mentioned these two plans, but our citywide plans really have these six elements, these six vision or guiding principles. And so the Neighborhood Planning Initiative, we desire to look at these six elements and understand how you within your neighborhood see these. How do they apply? How do you translate these six citywide vision elements for your neighborhood? And so engaging in conversation with you all is one way that we will get to calibrate and modify these guiding principles to really truly be unique to your neighborhood and to the needs within your community. And so with that, that was pretty quick, I know, but again, we really want to make sure that we spend time engaging in your questions. On the screen in front of you is my contact information. For anyone who's maybe only listening, my email address is my name. It's eugene.howard@denvergov.org. So again, that's eugene.howard@denvergov.org. And then the West Area Plan has its own dedicated website, and you can find that at denvergov.org/westplan. And with that, Naomi, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll be happy to take any questions that have come in.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I don't have any questions in the chat right now, but I know we've got I think Bruce And Jenny watching, and I remember Jenny, we actually were, she and her husband, we were talking a couple of days ago about a potential proposal that Councilman Sandoval is doing to allow detached ADUs. And so I know that they are very interested in maybe what efforts there are in terms of preservation and in keeping the unique character of neighborhoods. Oh, I see, Bruce, you just raised your hand. But maybe before we get to your question, if Eugene, you could talk a little bit about the last stakeholder meeting that we just had and the kind of historic preservation efforts and other tools that this plan is contemplating to help preserve what makes these places unique while also accommodating change.
Excellent. And that's an excellent question. Thank you for raising it. Often in the planning process and in the planning field, we talk about new development and things and how we want to see our places in the future. And through this neighborhood planning initiative, we are also very deliberately recognizing our past and the great places that we already get to experience. So Naomi was just mentioning our February steering committee meeting that we had a week or so ago was really truly dedicated solely to the topic of preservation. What are those places? Whether they be a physical structure or someone's home or an area, or even something more conceptual like a view plane, that has meaning to a community. We are looking at creative ways to think about preservation that go beyond what I think most of us are used to. That old historic building that a famous person built or that a famous person lived in. That is a part of how we have and how many cities look at historic preservation. But there's also those places where movements were born, where community members lived and maybe had and sparked an idea, or maybe where a small business started. And so there are opportunities for us through this process to identify and recognize and celebrate those places and architectural styles. We've heard a lot about the materials in Westenberg, the brick, the design of the brick, having front porches that really engage the street. And so those are ideas that we can take in from you all and factor into the recommendations so that when we are talking about when future development occurs, whether it's next year or 15 years from now, that we are capturing the characteristics and the essence of the neighborhoods that are important to you and important to you today, and can speak to those ideas and those concepts and those elements in the plan, so that anyone who's coming along later who would like to do a project, they have a starting point. They know what's important to these communities, and so that they can incorporate those things from the very start. And then of course, there's the actual preservation side. So we learned a lot about should a place or a structure meet the qualifications of being dedicated and recognized through that historic preservation lens, that is a way to unlock some tax credits and incentives so that a homeowner who might be challenged between maintaining their home or in the pressures of perhaps selling the home, they don't have to default to selling, but maybe can tap into these resources to make those necessary upgrades or repairs so that the home stays intact and that person stays in community. And so those are some of the ways that we have been thinking about and talking with the community about preservation. Looking at some opportunities to create incentives so that the home or that small business doesn't have to be replaced, but can be reinvested in and remain a part of the community. So we're looking at that broadly to be as creative as we can so that we can really truly hold up and celebrate the culture and the history and the heritage of these neighborhoods. So hopefully that gets a little bit at the question.
Awesome. And if you have any follow-ups, Jenny, we can unmute you, or you can put more questions in the chat too. Happy to keep that conversation going.
One thing while you're getting another question, I want to make sure that it's clear that while we had a dedicated meeting focused on that topic for our 6 neighborhoods, it's not as if that's a one-time only conversation. We want to continue this conversation and hear more about the places that are important to you all, so that we can continue to hear about them and learn about them and include them as examples in the planning process. So nothing that we do is ever just one time only. So do know that you all are welcomed and encouraged to participate in that ongoing conversation.
Yeah, good point. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. This isn't the end of the community conversations. It's really the beginning in many ways. Awesome. All right, Bruce, I'm gonna allow you to talk. Go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks for putting this whole Ask a Planner series together. Eugene, this is Bruce O'Donnell. Good to see you. And I have a client with a large property within the planning area for the West Area Plan that we're considering working on a rezoning on coming up here quickly. And it is an affordable housing opportunity. And I've been on the city's website trying to kind of come up to speed and look at things like recommendations for future land uses and kind of those designations and so forth. And I'm having trouble finding anything. Is there a draft plan or some draft of mapping for the plan that's available?
That's a good question. Where we are right now in the process is developing that material. So you're right in that you haven't seen anything online because we haven't gotten to that point yet. The material that is being developed is going through an internal review. So we worked with the stakeholder committee. We developed ideas based off of the input that we received. We reviewed that with our planning services colleagues. We're going through a similar review with the Department of Parks and Rec and Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And once those reviews get concluded and we share this material back to the steering committee and make sure that, again, that we're listening and that we're getting it right, then there will be a public facing document. And so that might still be a few weeks out before there's something posted. And then of course, we want to do a huge push to make sure that it's out there and that you all are aware. But in the meantime, what I would suggest that you use as a reference would be Blueprint Denver, since Blueprint Denver is the foundation that we're starting from. And there's quite robust land use recommendations in that document. So happy to talk with you more if that would be helpful. But what is currently out and available, I would say use Blueprint Denver as your current guide until we get to a place with the West Area planning process where the material that the community has tailored and sculpted is ready to be released.
Okay, Eugene, thank you. That's helpful. In the meantime, would it be appropriate perhaps for me to send you some information on this site so that the planning team at the city has an idea of what we're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Perhaps while we're still on this Zoom, you may get an email from me.
Okay.
And I'm going to lower my hand and thank you again.
Thank you for your.
I guess I'll mute myself. Is that what I should do?
You can mute yourself. I can mute you for you if you want. I have that power. Actually, I think this is a really interesting opportunity, Bruce, that you're on. We don't, at these conversations, we don't usually have people. So this kind of is the intersection of plans and then how they sort of get reflected specifically in how they get acted upon in the private sector. Because plans will develop recommendations that the public sector, i.e. the city, will act on. Some of those things are like Eugene was mentioning, investment in future roadways or intersections or partnerships like that. But another big part of it are these visioning documents and these maps that we were talking about that guide private investment and development going forward. And that's what Bruce is talking about. And we don't often get that perspective on these calls. I think it's interesting that you're here, and maybe just for other people that are listening, this might be an interesting opportunity to just talk a little bit about how plan guidance actually impacts development, or what we may see, what type of things are in Blueprint Denver that you mentioned. Like, why would someone who is trying to build affordable housing need to and want to reference our adopted plans? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so Naomi, it's Bruce. Are you wanting me to respond to that, or?
Well, a little bit of both. Maybe Eugene first, and then you.
Yeah,
You don't mind?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing that I know we can do more to share information with the public. So thank you for this opportunity to respond to that. So our documents, and particularly coming out of community planning and development, I would encourage folks to think of them as visionary, sort of aspirational documents. Sometimes there are very specific projects that are a part of those plans, or we identify key intersections where we know that there are some challenges, and we really hear from communities, if you're going to start somewhere in the city, please start in these places first. And so getting pretty specific, those are the ways that our documents really help guide the public attention for investment based off of your needs as community members. And then when it comes to the private side, I think, and we hope, that we are capturing the vision and the aspirations of a community so that this becomes a guiding document for the private side. So for example, there are several reasons why we might want to locate housing or businesses closer to our light rail, our West Line. For people who may choose not to have a car, or for whatever reason they would prefer not to drive as much as maybe they would have to if they lived in other parts of the city. A person might choose to live near a transit station, and we have lots of people who that's kind of their style of living. And so we want to make sure that things are thought about near that transit center, that transit area. We refer to it often as transit-oriented development. So a nice mixture of housing and business opportunities. We want to make sure that it's well connected, that whether that's be through bike trails and recreational trail system, making sure that there are parks nearby, so that if we are hearing that multi-unit or like apartment type development is best located near transit, then that's a way that we can capture that feedback, make sure that all of the other supports are nearby as well for that overall quality of life and for that overall complete vision for a community. And then that is something that I'll let Bruce answer, but that what we hope is that when the private side is looking for places that meets their sort of their projects that they're interested in doing or the type of work that they want to do, they can pick up this plan, look through it and say, oh, okay, senior housing is important to this community. And this community has also said that senior housing, when it's built, should be near a park. And in this plan, here are some park areas. And the vision for this community is to have places for seniors to live near these parks. And so that is how we hope that our plans serve as a recipe, if you will, or sort of a roadmap for not only the city investment, but for the private sector.
Thanks, Eugene. And I'll jump in just before Bruce, you speak to that. It also informs, so when a developer or any owner of a property asks for some sort of change to their property, such as a rezoning, because that's something that we often see. A rezoning, for instance, someone wanting to ask for the ability to build higher or in a different way. When those go through the process of those have to come through the legislative process of going to planning board, and then they're all voted on by city council. And both planning board and city council and community planning and development at the very first step, they look through the lens when they're evaluating these applications. They use the plans as a lens. It's actually part of these 5 criteria that we are all legally bound by to look at when evaluating the merit of one of these asks. So that's another place where these plans are really important. They're very important when a change is being requested or evaluated. And perfect.
Hi again. This is Bruce, and I would add to this discussion that often through development and redevelopment, it's the private sector that implements the city's plans. And that happens first in a kind of a regulatory context, and perhaps through a rezoning, and then ultimately by actual, building of new buildings. And so in terms of the plans, the city's adopted plans, informing rezoning decisions and goals, we often look to Blueprint Denver, of course, but to the extent there's an adopted neighborhood plan or small area plan, that is increasingly important because Blueprint, in fact, defers in some instances to a neighborhood plan or a small area plan because they can be more fine-tuned and focus on a specific part of the city rather than the city as a whole. And so the opportunity to be involved in any planning process, such as the West Area Plan, and to get community input and so forth is very important, because when we bring a rezoning forward, we want it to comply with and be supported by, and in fact implement an area plan. And so as I mentioned earlier, my interest in being on this call today and getting involved in the process as it kind of reopens up, it sounds like here in a few weeks, has to do to make sure that we're aware of what's going on and able to contribute and provide input and listen and learn and all those kind of things. So I don't know, Naomi, if that is answering or addressing the topic you brought up, that it's part of why I'm participating today.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, and it can be difficult too when we're kind of in between plans like this. I think it's great that you're being so proactive and saying, well, there are already quite a few plans for this area, and there's Blueprint Denver, which for those who don't know is kind of this overarching, very large scale citywide maps and plans and things. But we are in this process right now where the community is really refining their vision for the area. So it's great to check in on that. So we have a question from Jenny, which I think is super interesting for Eugene. If you could talk about some environmental factors, specifically noise and pollution levels, and how I almost want to bring up our equity maps and stuff too, because the city does measure a lot of things about how environment and pollution impact, and then the plan can address those type of things. So take it away.
Sure. This is a really good question, and is several issues that we are addressing and hearing a lot about in the West Area Plan areas. That when you think about the neighborhoods of Sun Valley and Val Verde, and as Naomi was just mentioning, sort of their history over time, and the values that were in place at different points in Denver's history. You know, thinking about the river and going back 100 or more years, there was a sentiment really around the nation, if not around the world, that natural resources had to be tamed. We had to control them. You know, the Army Corps of Engineers, they do amazing work, but I think when they started, their mission was to try to wrestle nature under control. And every place had that thinking for quite some time. And what that has kind of then led to is we had a point in time when we were working with or trying to control the river. We placed a lot of industry near and around the river. And for any long-term resident or person who's familiar with Denver's history, you will know that I believe in the 1960s, the South Platte River flooded. And unfortunately, the impacts to the Valverde neighborhood were quite severe and very significant. And many homes were lost, those homes and businesses that were located near the river. And so thinking, you know, 50 years ago, well, how do you come back from this condition? And then what do you do so that you're not putting people's lives in danger? We place a lot of industry there. You've got a lot of warehouses and sort of commercial activity. And we need those as a city. There's nothing wrong with having industrial in our city. But at the time, 50 years ago, it really meant paving over surfaces. And so we have a lot of concrete, a lot of ground covered by these impenetrable materials, asphalt, concrete, which only, as we now know, exacerbates sort of when it rains and the runoff and when snow is melting, all that water picks up all of the materials off of those hard surfaces, and it's all sort of rushing towards the river. We now, in our sort of current culture, recognize the value of our natural resources, and in many ways are trying to undo those decisions from, you know, decades past. So in the West area specifically, we are looking at opportunities that might arise as we do public or private investment to introduce more green places, introduce, you know, sort of replace some of that hard surface with natural areas. Think about, we have a concept that we call green streets. So when we have to go in and make repairs to a street or you know, maybe redo a street because it's at the end of its life cycle, let's look for opportunities to introduce native plants that will then capture some of that storm water before it just runs into the river to help clean it. So it, you know, natural sort of percolation and filtration approaches that have been around since we've been around forever can be used to clean the water before it gets to the South Platte. And while we're at it, while trees aren't necessarily native to our high plains desert environment, we do have trees here in Denver. And so how can we introduce the trees and the types of vegetation that can provide for the cooling of these places? Because another sort of unintended consequence of impervious or paved surfaces is that how much heat it absorbs, and then at night it's sort of reflecting back into the atmosphere, which is kind of throwing off our climate systems, our natural climate systems. The heat island effect is what that is often referred to as, because as all that heat from all the hot surfaces is radiating back out into the atmosphere, you know, it makes our city stay warmer longer, which isn't over the long term really in our best health interests. So in the West specifically, we are looking for ways to redo or rethink these public rights of way and encouraging the same types of behavior on the private side for private property owners. And the more vegetation that we have that can clean the water, It's also helping to clean our air. And depending on where we have these types of natural solutions, they could also help mitigate noise. Having a row of trees, next to a busy street can help sort of absorb or dampen the noise reverberating off of all those hard surfaces. So it's not any one solution. It's really truly a whole collection of different things that we can try and that we should try. Of course, we want to make sure that we're hearing and responding to what you community members are asking for. But those are some of the ways that we can approach or address multiple issues. The health of the environment, the health of the ground, the health of our water and natural areas, addressing the sound concerns, cleaning the air and the pollution, while also introducing natural beauty that just adds to the overall sense of our natural beings and our overall sense in mental health, physical well-being, and quality of life.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eugene. I have a question that may be a little trickier, but since noise and pollution was brought up, I think we have to talk about the fact that CDOT is involved in this area, which is not the city. And maybe you could talk a little bit how plans, how does the city plan for having to deal with basically property it doesn't own and a entity that is above us in many ways, because this part of Denver is so impacted by it. We've got I-25, we've got 6, we've got Colfax, we've got a lot of stuff going on that is maybe not quite as easy for the city to say, well, we can do this, but we have to partner with CDOT. And unfortunately, if you don't know, CDOT can be a little hard to work with. Not that they do a great job, they're great people, but it's another level of coordination and we can't direct them in the same way.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up because you're right. As much as we would love to inform all aspects of our community, both public, private, we also have our other state and federal agencies. And really the planning effort, it serves a similar role with regard to those other agencies. We want to make sure that your wishes and desires as community members get shared, whether it's with us or with a developer like Mr. O'Donnell, or it's CDOT or the Federal Transit Administration for that matter. So, and the beauty of this is the people who work at these institutions are people just like us, and many of them are from our communities. So they understand. We do have to engage them in conversation. We do need to share with them what the visions and aspirations are. And then when they are thinking about doing projects or thinking about work, they too have a starting point. They also get to understand what's important to the communities that they are working in, or the sort of facilities or the things that they are responsible for that are a part of our communities. So thinking about federal, yes, that is a state highway. And yes, CDOT has the sort of ultimate jurisdiction over what happens on Federal Boulevard and West Colfax and Alameda and Sheridan. But we get to work with them and we get to inform and we get to share information with them to help sculpt and calibrate the projects that they might want to do in these areas. So I think our plans and your voice gets to be reflected and shared to those organizations in the same way that it's shared with us. And I will say that I've been encouraged by the willingness for those larger institutions to really truly listen to our local voices.
Yes, that's very true. I did not mean to throw them under the bus. They're wonderful. And actually, there is a project going on right now for West Colfax for pedestrian safety improvements. That's a big partnership. There is funding, and this is separate from this plan, but there's all sorts of things going on where there are partnerships looking at how to improve safety and well-being on these streets. So a lot of coordination does happen. But I think, so Jenny, you followed up and asked, aside from planting greenery, which is a great, amazing tool, and trees are the best for reducing noise and air pollution, kind of what other solutions are we thinking about? And maybe one of the reasons I brought up CDOT is more just from my experience helping constituents up in actually more near I-70. We get a lot of people concerned about the barriers, the sound walls that go along and how they are not kept up at all. Oh, thanks, Bruce, you have to go. Thank you so much for being here and helping answer some questions. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Bye.
Yeah, bye. So I think that was, I don't know if that was at all what you were thinking of, but I just kind of, that's where my brain went first because I work with a lot of constituents asking about those. I would say, if I were to answer this question a little bit, that there's a lot of really interrelated things going on. And so there's, in the plan, I think some of the best things that we can do, honestly, to mitigate noise and air pollution are policies like encouraging an urban environment that doesn't require people to drive everywhere, where because if we're talking about what are the sources of those noise and pollution issues, a lot of them are vehicle based. So, and this isn't just part of, the West area plan, this is an entire city and regional thing. Like, we need to think about how to mitigate the very root causes of the pollution and the noise. So any policies that help promote small, walkable, diverse neighborhoods, bicycle and pedestrian and, public transit, those kind of things. And then, interestingly, I wonder, and actually this is a question for you, Eugene, I don't know this, but in terms of air pollution, obviously, probably the biggest source of air pollution is vehicles. I don't know that for sure, but I'm going to just say that. But since there are large industrial areas in the West area, what does the plan, is the plan able to address things like pollutants or the behavior of kind of industrial areas in that way? Or does that live in very different regulatory documents in the city? Is that something that would be in the plan, basically?
So great questions, both Naomi and Jenny. Really, we are not necessarily a regulatory body with regard to pollutants. That would be more DDPHE, the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment, and the state version, CDPHE. Same names, just
Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment.
So through the community planning and development and through the plans that we do, we don't get to the level of regulation related to the particulates and those types of things. But where I think plans do have a voice and can address these issues is being more forward-looking and aspirational and visionary. So, for example, I want to address both sort of topics. Thinking about cars and thinking about sources that cause these issues. And I do think that we can talk about electrification. Now, I know electricity gets produced and ways that electricity gets produced also cause pollutants. But if we are thinking about solar and other wind and geothermal and look for ways to encourage those types of solutions within our built environment so that we are addressing and responding to pollution versus our more traditional fossil fuels. I do think that is a way that we get at it. Denver is really pushing the envelope and is working really hard to be a leader when it comes to sustainability. we have a whole department now that has been stood up to really truly look at sustainable practices throughout the entire city, not just in energy production, but how we build our buildings, how we place our buildings in our neighborhoods, to what Naomi was talking about. If you don't have to drive 3 miles to get fresh fruits and vegetables because they are accessible in your neighborhood, maybe it's not a huge King Supers, but maybe it's a smaller family-owned, locally owned grocery store where you can get your basic fresh fruits and vegetables, those needs met. And it's a place that you can walk to. And you've got the nice sidewalk that's comfortable, and it's got some trees to give you some shade. And so it's a holistic look and a holistic approach that we hear people asking us for, and how we want to respond and reflect that in the plans that we produce. And then, so that, and the other component to that is we have currently it's voluntary, but the City and County of Denver has a green building guide. It's similar to our more traditional building code, but we have now a green version, if you will, of building code, where we are really truly trying to encourage the private sector to look at some of these new and emerging approaches to what they do and how we construct the places that we live in, so that they are more energy efficient, and are looking at ways to introduce, maybe it's electric vehicles or transit that's also using some of these new technologies that ultimately get at cleaning our air and moving us around and allowing us to make choices that are beneficial to our own health and well-being. And there's one other thing I was going to mention, but it escaped me. I think it'll come back to me. But it is a holistic approach, and it does really truly take us looking at all the different pieces in order to have those big solutions. Oh, you were talking about industrial. Within our industrial areas, industry is so vital to the success of our city. We really rely on our industrial areas to provide jobs, good paying jobs to our residents. And the West area does have a substantial collection of industrial activities, where I think we can encourage those business owners and those corporations is as they look to modernize, or if they've got some maintenance to do, to draw from the Green Building Code, for example, or put solar on top of your flat roof, so that you are creating energy and perhaps even creating more energy than you use. Think about electrification, and think about some of those improvements that I mentioned earlier around stormwater. So business X, if you have to rebuild the sidewalk, when you rebuild your sidewalk, this time put a little green space in it as well. So there are a number of ways that we can encourage sort of forward-looking, future-thinking ideas that address things like pollution and noise and sound, without, because it's not our role to regulate those particulates and those points of pollution.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Eugene. I think that that's a great kind of circling back to how these plans work and what their role is in all the different ways that we envision the future in the city. Because as much as when I talk about the NPI, the Neighborhood Planning Initiative, I love to say that there really is something in it for everyone. It really does try to holistically attack all topics that create good, healthy, thriving communities. But at the same time, I know when I've had conversations with people and show them what examples of plans that have recently been adopted from other neighborhoods look like, sometimes it can be a little confusing because the language and the recommendations and policies that are written in them are very high level and they're very aspirational. And, for instance, you might not see that thing that you are super passionate about in there in exact language, like Eugene mentioned, like capping particulate matter. But there may be something more about sustainability more in general. They are, if what I hope that our council office can do as well is help you figure out, I always want to help people figure out where they can direct and practice their power as a citizen. And if there is something that you really care about that maybe isn't so much something that is going to go into the plan, like we are still listening. And you can come to me, and Eugene, has an incredible amount of knowledge about the city too. We will tell you where, if it's not this plan, like where you can go and get engaged with your city, or maybe it's the state level, to take action on the things that really matter to you. And with that, I know we've gone over because we just love talking about planning. But thank you so much. I know Jenny has to sign off, and she says thank you. I put some in the chat. I put some links if anyone is interested. The West Colfax pedestrian improvements that I mentioned that are happening, they're going to be funded. They're mostly planned out, but there'll be some great changes for Colfax. And then if anyone is really interested in sustainability in Northwest Denver particularly, we do have an organization called the Northside Sustainability Alliance, which is a kind of a super group from all our different registered neighborhood organizations. They came together to create one group for our whole district that just focuses on nature and sustainability. So check them out if you're interested in that. And with that, thank you so much, Eugene. It's always great to talk to you. And I will say we're going to have him back in a few months when there are actually recommendations out, and be able to walk through some of those and really kick off the feedback and engagement part of the plan then. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for this opportunity. I just really am grateful to spend this time with you today.
Awesome. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And again, this will be posted on our YouTube channel for the future. Thanks. Bye.